Oh, my volume should be on. Can people at home hear me? Can I get a thumbs up or? Excellent, perfect. Okay, are we ready to start? Hello, lovely to see everyone. Thank you all enormously for coming this cold evening. One thing that I wanted to do is if we could maybe dedicate the learning this evening to a dear friend of mine who's currently quite unwell with COVID in hospital. So that's Aaron Noach ben Ahuva Yehudit. If we could dedicate the learning, then, you know, thankfully the person's doing well and on the improve, but I think could certainly use our tefillot at this moment. And if our learning can be to facilitate their continued improvement, that would be greatly appreciated to me, and I know to other people as well. Also, as a preliminary remark, to note that I recognize that the content that we're learning is incredibly personal and difficult for people, and that's something that I think is important to name from the outset, that, you know, this is a bit more emotionally charged than, you know, milk spoons and fleishy pots. And in that view, you know, I think that that sensitivity hopefully will come across in the way that I speak and present, and that's certainly something that I'm seeking to convey. And I hope, you know, in all of the thoughts that people share here this evening as well, that would be greatly appreciated. Hillel, if you want a source sheet, there's one here. Okay, I am speaking closer to the microphone so people hear. Thank you. So with regards to the specific content for tonight, what I'm hoping that we'll do is we're hoping to finish as last week in about an hour, 45 minutes, we will hear me speak. And what I think is actually a lot more interesting, in the last 15 minutes, we'll be privileged to hear from Shimon Allen. Shimon is along with his wife, are the founders of Bet Raphael, and they have done a lot of incredible work in a lot of different areas to facilitate people in our communities' engagement with the healthcare system being as smooth as it can be. And specifically what we're going to hear from Shimon about tonight is the work that Bet Raphael has done regarding advanced care directives, and particularly advanced care directives in an Australian Victorian context. So that's something that I think, you know, we can all learn more about. And that's why we've got the big fancy TV here on my right, so that we can project Shimon to the entire audience here. Let's get started at the start. So like we mentioned last week, fundamentally, Judaism, halakha, really has a strong place for valuing life and valuing all life. And, you know, we saw last week, and we were talking about the specific contexts of just a general person at a particular point in their life. And we were saying that there is immense value to that life, and that, you know, that person has an obligation even at times to seek medical attention, to look after themselves and to look after their bodies. What we'll do tonight is focus that conversation particularly in end-of-life settings, and as we focus on end-of-life care. So I think, you know, just to give us some terms that are necessary to discuss this concept, the first term I'd say is Chaye Olam. So that's what I've put at the very, very top. And that's referring to, a literal translation would be eternal life. And what exactly that means, you know, none of us are going to live forever. However, eternal life is general settings, what we can maybe call it, when we're coming to questions of whether to introduce. And it's really more relevant as we start to contrast it with Chaye Sha'ah, which is a more, you know, life for an hour would be the literal translation, but it refers to life in a more temporary sense. It's an acknowledgement that a person is nearing the end of their life. You know, terminal is maybe a way that people could understand it. It's an acknowledgement that people are nearing the end of their life. And in these two halachic terms, halachic phrases, Chaye Olam and Chaye Sha'ah, what the rabbis do by playing these terms off each other is recognize that not only in a situation of Chaye Olam is all life valuable, but even in a context of Chaye Sha'ah is life valuable. Even in a context of someone who will not, if things go their natural course, have an abundance of time in this world, that life, even if it is only for a relatively short amount of time, is incredibly valuable and valued by the Jewish tradition. So we keep moving and we see sort of homiletic statements like in Pirkei Avot, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Yafeh sha'a achat b'tshuva u'masim tovim ba'olam hazeh. 1 hour of good deeds, of repentance in this world is preferable, is better than mikol chayei olam haba, all of the life in the world to come. And this sort of homiletic statement is then transposed into halachic conversations and as a way of entering into noticing that all life is valuable. Like we spoke about last week, we have to appreciate what discourse we're participating in. Sometimes, when we're talking about Pirkei Avot, now we know that Pirkei Avot, ethics of the fathers, is not something that we would necessarily assume gives us halachic guidance. We have to distinguish, are we talking about halacha in terms of how people should practically act in their lives, as opposed to what are the values of the rabbis more generally? And I think what's important to note is that Pirkei Avot, this statement gets moved from that sort of broader ethics conversation into the halachic conversation by the rabbis. So this idea that, a life in this world, an hour in this world, an hour of good deeds is incredibly valued and valuable, finds its way into halacha as well. And more than that, if we extend that idea, it's not just a person who spends their time doing teshuvah and masim tovim. Because you could then make the argument, well, what about someone who doesn't exactly do the best things with their life? What about someone who, rather than spending their time doing teshuvah and masim tovim, maybe spends their time doing less savory things? Is that life still valuable? If you can extend that life, is that something that we value as a tradition? Is that halachically necessary? So the answer is yes, yes. But we need to take that idea from these homiletic statements, from these, we need to interpret that idea more generally and say that, no, the point is not that people necessarily act well in their lives. The point is that all life is valuable. And we can see this idea emerge in the Rambam, where often a good way to see how valuable life is to see when the rabbis look at the laws of Shabbat and look at when the laws of Shabbat can be pushed off. So, like we spoke about last week, if someone collapses, do you call the ambulance on Shabbat? Of course. Now, what's going on when that happens? Well, at a deep level, what's going on is the rabbi saying Shabbat is incredibly important. We're not saying Shabbat is not important. Shabbat is incredibly important. You're not brushing off coffee with a friend. Shabbat is incredibly important. And nonetheless, you need to pick up the phone and call the ambulance. Now, we can talk about how and why that works, but when Shabbat laws get moved aside, when Shabbat laws get the way to keep Shabbat becomes picking up the phone and calling the ambulance, that's a foil to how important these laws are. And that lets us see how important these laws are. And that's exactly what the Rambam says. So the Rambam talks about a case where a building collapses on Shabbat. And the building collapses, and we don't even know if a person's underneath the building. We don't know. They might be there, they might not. Should you excavate the building on Shabbat and look for the person? How come?
Because they might be there.
Okay.
And if they might be there, then it's an obligation to try to save them.
That's right.
And if there's nobody there, well, you try.
Excellent. So I think what's important to notice is it's not they're definitely there. We're not saying in certain situations of pikuach nefesh, you're meant to override Shabbat. We're saying in all situations where there's a maybe, that's when you jump in. And this is where the Rambam extends it, which is matza'uhu chai, if you find the person alive. However, and this is that phrase that we encountered, chayei sha'a, if that person is only likely to be alive for a short period of time, do you continue excavating on Shabbat or not? So lots of people are nodding. And again, why? Just to spell it out. Pardon?
There might be other people.
So even before the fact that there might be other people underneath in that rubble, that individual person's life, even if it is only going to exist for a short period because they are not going to be able to survive the injury, that life is still incredibly valuable. And that life needs to be saved. And that even if we need to break Shabbat, or what I like to interpret it as is keep Shabbat differently in order to save that life. Are we all on the same page about that?
You could put it another way.
Mm-hmm.
Who will we decide how long that person is going to live?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, but what I'm trying to say is I want to extend that idea, and I want us to have it clear in our mind, and this next source will do it for us, that we don't need to rely on well, maybe if we excavate them, we might be able to save them forever. What we're trying to say is that there's intrinsic value to every moment of life, irrespective of whether that moment is going to be followed by many more moments or not. I think that's an important point to drill down into, especially as we start to think of end-of-life considerations, that it's not just because I might be able to extend their life even longer. Like, there's an intrinsic value to every individual moment, irrespective of what that moment is followed by.
So if I understand what you're saying, also, here we have a real person who's injured, and there might be others who are injured as well. But the obligation is we deal with the real person who's there in front of us. And the prime thing is to care for that person as ahead of looking for others who might be injured.
Yeah, well, the others who might be injured is a thing that we have to think about as well. I guess what we're sort of lucky in some ways is the Rambam has very restricted case. He's referring to a case where there's maybe one person underneath or maybe not. So, but in general, yes, if we would add on other cases and we would think about maybe there are other people underneath, then we'd start to have to do a bit more thinking. But just the principle that exists is sort of what I'm trying to extract from the Rambam. Is that okay? Yeah. Let's keep going. And the Shulchan Aruch. So I'm not going to introduce the Rambam, even though I'm really proud of these little bios that I've been writing on the side. I think they're really cool. You're all welcome. So these bios, we went through the Rambam last time, so I've just written it there, but I'm not going to go through some of his background and history, but maybe we'll spend a little bit of time on Rabbi Yosef Cairo. So Rabbi Yosef Cairo is known as primarily the author of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the authoritative code of Jewish law. The Shulchan Aruch, and we'll encounter the notes on the Shulchan Aruch, which are written by the Rama. We'll encounter them soon. But the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, his opinion becomes authoritative in Sephardi understandings, and the Rama, who writes notes on the Shulchan Aruch, his opinion is authoritative in Ashkenazi settings. So, and he lives, both of them are living approximately about 1500. Rabbi Yosef Cairo is living in Israel, in Tzfat, and the Rama is living in Krakow. You can actually go to Krakow and see the Rama's shul, which is a fascinating thing if anyone's done that. But Rabbi Yosef Cairo says, Hagos says, and of course, he doesn't make things up himself. He's basing himself on previous parts of Torah learning. So often that's, either the Gemara itself or it's the Gemara as it's understood by the Rishonim, who are the ones who preceded Rabbi Yosef Cairo in the 500 years before him. So Hagos says, and this is a new term that we also have to learn to be part of this conversation. This is a person who is very much towards the end of life. This is a person who it's difficult to nut down exactly what we're talking about, because the simplest way is, a person within 3 days of the end of their life. But that can be extended by subsequent rabbis to be more broadly understood to be a person who's terminal, depending on if they're suffering. And there's a whole conversation exactly who this gosses and what the definition of this gosses is. But for our purposes, what we need to know is it's a person who's towards the very end of their life. A person who is a gosses, a person who is at the very end of their life, harehu kachai l'chol dvarav. This person is considered living in all respects. Again, all life is valuable intrinsically. We're not going to do the entirety of the rest of the Shulchan Aruch, just to notice that he then brings a series of examples. Those examples are, number one, things which you would do to prepare a dead body for the burial. And the Shulchan Aruch is saying you are not allowed to do any of those acts that would prepare a body for burial. And number two are things that would hasten the death. And you're also not allowed to do any of those. So you're not allowed to do things that would hasten the death. And you're also not allowed to prepare for the burial before the person has passed on. That's the essence of the Shulchan Aruch, with very specific examples of what they understood that was at the time. But today, you know, we might have different examples of what would extend a person's life. Let's keep going. And the Aruch HaShulchan, who's a 19th century rabbi, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Halevi Epstein, he spells out what this statement that the Gosses is like a living person in every single way. The Afal Pisha Anu Ro'im, and even though we see that the person is in pain, a lot of pain at this end of his life stage, the Tovlo Hamavet, and the person in some ways prefers to no longer be alive. Mikol Makom, nonetheless, Asur Lanu La'asot Davar, we are not able to do anything, Lekarev Mitato, to bring forward the person's death. Baha'olam umlo'o shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the world and everything inside it is in some ways God's, is belonging to God. V'kach ratzon yitbarach, and this is God's will. That's a very heavy statement, but I think that's an important thing just that needs to be said out loud, is that definitely in terms of taking active measures to shorten a person's life, the halachic view is that that is not something which is aligned with the halachic perspectives. Give me one sec. And so, for example, you know, Victoria has a voluntary assisted dying act, and accessing that voluntary assisted dying in terms of a halachic perspective, I recognize that there are lots of things going on in people's lives, and people have lots of complicated decisions and value systems, but from a halachic perspective, that does not align with the halachic perspective. Yes, questions?
If someone is
yeah.
Is like high doses of painkillers that may not be healthy if they were healthy, like is that an issue?
Yeah, so excellent. Really, really good question. I'm going to repeat the question for Zoom. What was your name, sorry? Shoshi. Shoshi asked a lovely question, which is, in palliative care settings, people are often prescribed high doses of various medications, which on the one hand relieve their pain, but on the other hand, in some ways may hasten their death. How does that work? So I think in that sort of setting, intentionality plays a really, really big part. And if the intention of the person who's prescribing the medication, the intention of the person who's taking the medication is to bring about death in a sooner sense, that would be one type of conversation. Whereas if the intention is to remove suffering, that would be a different conversation. And even though we're talking about doing the same thing, and this is something that, you know, we're going to come back to over and over again, is that everything that I'm providing tonight is a guide. Everything that I'm providing tonight is super high level, and individual cases, like we spoke about last week, need guidance from an individual rabbi who understands the nuances of those cases, working together with the medical team, which, you know, by the way, that's something that Raphael can also help people. But yeah, intentionality really matters. Does that help? Yeah, Hillel?
I don't know if this is something that will come up later, but with what we just saw about the prohibition of hastening death, is that only on the doctor or the people around the sick person, or does that apply to the sick person themselves as well?
Yeah, so I think my understanding is that it applies generally. It applies generally.
Yeah. So, sorry, just to clarify, that extends, like if you're a Jewish practicing doctor and a non-Jewish patient has asked you for assisted dying, you can't help them?
Yeah, so I don't want to say any specifics of what people should or shouldn't do. And I think, you know, about specific cases, people should reach out to their rabbis and to work that out together with their rabbis. However, certainly the sources that we've looked at strongly view a need to not prescribe VAD, for example, the medication. But yeah, have individual conversations about individual cases. I just want to keep it at that really high level. Okay, yes. That's okay.
We're praying for someone's speedy recovery or whatever, but what about praying for someone's share?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of rabbinic sources that talk about that, interestingly enough. And there's a fascinating story, for example, about one of the maidservants of one of the big rabbis, Rebbe. And in that story, there are like some of his students who are praying for him to keep living, but she is praying for the opposite. And what ends up happening is she actually ends up distracting them, and then he ends up dying. And there's a question of how to view that story, depending on one perspective is that she's right and the students are not right. Another perspective is, no, the students are right and she's done the not correct thing. So I think, how that story gets used by different rabbinic decisors, different poskim, different people who make halachic decisions is really indicative of what they think. I think that, certainly in situations where people are at the end of their life and people are suffering, and we're going to see some of the relevant considerations that the rabbis draw on, the considerations change drastically. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. Any other questions? I'll keep moving. Yep.
How authoritative is the final source?
So it's authoritative in and of itself, but it's not the entire picture. And that's what I want to bring us to in the next source. So in the next source, we're going to start to see an opening emerge. So the Shulchan Aruch, like we spoke about, has notes written on it by the Ramah. Again, 15th century, this time we're in Krakow as opposed to in Israel. And the Ramah starts off the same way. And so too, asur ligrom lamavet sheyamut mehera. You are not allowed to do anything that will cause a person to die earlier than they would have otherwise. Aval. But, and with that one word, the Ramah flips, but changes total direction and provides that opening that I was talking about. Im yesh sham davar shegaram ikov yetziat hanefesh. If there is something which is preventing a person from dying, you are allowed to remove things that are preventing someone from dying. So you're not allowed to actively do something to hasten someone's death, but you are allowed in specific situations to remove things that are preventing a person from dying. And the two examples that the Ramah brings are if you've got a woodcutter and the bang, bang, bang of the woodcutter is keeping the person alive by, keeping them focused or something. That's one example. The other example is someone who's got salt on their tongue. And the belief was salt on someone's tongue was in some way keeping them alive. You are allowed to remove the salt on their tongue, provided you don't touch them in the process, but that's a separate part of the conversation. Yep. So what's interesting for us is instead of thinking about salt on someone's tongue,
what about, say, you could turn off a machine?
A ventilator, a machine, exactly. Instead of thinking about salt on someone's tongue, think about a ventilator. Then what do you do? Suddenly, there's an opening that the Ramah introduces us to. And just to spell it out through two other sources, the Bet Lechem Yehuda, who's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, and he's then this idea is accepted by some subsequent poskim as well, says that more than this, in a person who's in this much suffering and this much pain, you shouldn't even be putting the salt on their tongue to start with. You shouldn't be extending their life of suffering. And obviously, we're going to see some of the considerations at play. For example, if that's what they want, then everything changes. However, from a sort of taking 3 steps back perspective, the Bet Lechem Yehuda says, 1 second, if someone has made the choice that they would like their life to be ended by its natural course, don't go about extending it if that's not what they want. And Rav Yaakov Israel Kanievsky, who's the Stipler is what he's known as, and that might be a name that's more familiar to some of you. He's a very famous Haredi community leader and posek. He 1985 was when he passed away. So he started off life in Ukraine and then made his way to Bnei Brak, I think about in the 30s. And we won't do the whole thing inside, but essentially says that there's this word on the street, there's this commonly held saying that you need to do everything to extend someone's life. And I also heard this when I was a child, is what he says. However, he says this idea is incorrect. Lo matzati isur. I looked through all the books and the stipler knew everything. Lo matzati isur. I didn't find a prohibition with removing the salt, if you will. But adarabba, yesh lilmod limnoa mizeh. We should be teaching people not to be putting the salt on in situations where people don't want it. So this concept of extending life at all costs, extending life always, even though there is intrinsic value to every life and to every minute of every life, that exists at the same time as these opening that we found rooted in the Ramah, which is that you are allowed to remove obstacles to someone dying. Is that okay? There's a lot there. You want to pause for questions for a second?
I was thinking about, for instance, say giving antibiotics to somebody who's dying anyway, to prolong their life, that it would be okay. And especially if they had already given a directive that they didn't want that in those circumstances.
Yeah. So we'll come to some specific cases and, we'll reference one rabbi's opinion about antibiotics soon. So keep that in the back of your mind. But yes, I'm hearing you.
I'm just wondering if the person themselves is unable to make that decision for themselves, what happens in that situation?
Yeah. So number one, and I think this is an excellent segue into what Shimon's going to be talking about. So Shimon's going to be talking about advanced care directives, which is where a person gets the opportunity to articulate what their values are. And the work that Raphael has done with their advanced care directive is helping using a Jewish framing and framework to articulate those values. And it has halachic backing, like he's worked really hard with a lot of rabbis to facilitate it. So there's a halachic component to it to make sure it ticks the halachic boxes, but at the same time, it lets any person articulate what their specific values and wants in complicated times are. All of that being said, in cases where a person might not have an advanced care directive, or in situations where people find themselves, family is often relied on. But just to sort of flip for a second, the test for kids is always a best interests test. It's what is best for this person. That's not the test that we use in medicine for adults. The test that we use in medicine for adults is a substitute decision maker. The question is, what would this person want? What are, as a sibling or as a whatever, parent, child, whoever it might be, this person really well. What's your understanding of what this person wants? Which is not the same question as what do you think is best for them, which is not the same question as what do you want. So the question is, what would they want? And that's where, we'll go to family and ask them, what would they want?
Question on Zoom. Is it okay not to perform resuscitation?
So I think, like I said, everything is situation specific. And there are certainly, and this is what we'll come to on the next page, is what are some of the considerations that the rabbis weigh up in giving direction about a question like that? So the answer is, it really depends on the individual case, but certainly conceivably, yes, there are cases when it is halachically appropriate to honor a person's do not resuscitate request. Yep.
Way up quality of life, not quantity of life.
Excellent. So we'll come to that in the next section, but primarily, quality of life is not the main thing that the rabbis are thinking about. They sort of treat life as a bit of a binary, that a person is alive and then a person is not alive, and the goal is about life, not necessarily focusing on the quality of that life. That being said, when it comes to weighing up a series of complicated parts of someone's life and of parts of someone's treatment, or whether it's appropriate to resuscitate or whether it's appropriate to consider some sort of active management, the rabbinic response to that will often weigh up quality of life as well, anticipated quality of life as well as current quality of life. What's going to happen in all of this? You have like, what happens if you do nothing? What happens if you pursue the treatment? And what happens if you pursue some alternatives as well? So it's always those, yes. So the short answer is yes, but maybe not in the way that it might be used in secular senses. Okay, let's keep going. On the next page, in section 3, I've tried to give us all, I read a bunch of shutim, a bunch of rabbinic responsa, and I jotted down what are some of the considerations that the rabbis are drawing on in providing people with guidance about whether or not they should be pursuing active treatment or undergoing a surgery, or their attitude towards a do not resuscitate request, etc., without getting into the specifics, because we could spend hours and hours and hours just pulling apart one of these responsa because there's so much in them. But these are some of the values. So the first thing to mention is rabbinic answers don't come in yes, no. Rabbinic answers often come in a much broader shade of gray. So especially in questions like this. So sometimes the rabbi will say, you must do this, like the halachic requirements on you are specific. In sometimes the rabbis will say, you should do this, but if you really want to, it's also halachically permissible for you to do that. So sometimes the rabbis will be a bit more equivocal and say, you can do this, but you can also do that. And sometimes they'll say, you shouldn't do this, but you can if you really want to. And sometimes they say, no, that's definitely one that you shouldn't do. So the answers are not as black and white as maybe people would expect them to be. In providing this guidance, what are some of the things that the rabbis weigh up? So we'll run through this list really quickly because, like I said, I think Shimon's much more interesting than me tonight. Patient preferences. What does the patient want? What's their wishes? How do they feel in the current situation? What's their relationship to it? What are the preferences of the family? And that's not just in a situation where the patient is incapacitated, for what it's worth. Is the patient suffering, and to what extent? How risky is the procedure? And risky can be understood as, sometimes this goes well and then this is the expected outcome. But in 10% of cases, you actually might not survive the procedure. What about if it's 20%? What if it's 30%? What if it's 50%? The riskiness of the procedure. So we have what's like, the expected outcome, but in addition to the expected outcome, the outcome could be, and this will be a question of, can you sacrifice chayei sha'ah for longer? Because if a person's towards the end of their life, but there's a potentially experimental curative treatment, they could get a lot longer, but the chances of it working are quite small. Riskiness.
Expected outcome sounds a bit strong there, because if you're saying it could go this way, it could go that way, then I think the expected outcome is the outcome you hope for if it happens, but it could just as well go badly. Yeah, so maybe I should have reframed and said expected outcome if it's successful, but then we need to define what success looks like. What does success mean? And then we need to ask questions about, well, for the doctor, they might have one metric of what success looks like, but for the patient, it might be a different metric, and for their family, it might be a third set of metrics. So what does success look like is another important question in all of this. Like we mentioned, and again, the quality of life, the anticipated quality in comparison to what's expected at the moment versus if we do embark on the treatment. Similarly, with regards to the length of life, the type of proposed treatment. Is it established or experimental? How likely is it to succeed? What do the doctors think? Which doctor's talking? The rabbis have specific attitudes, with all, like, I'm an intern at the hospital. Shouldn't value my opinion that much. Who's talking? Are you talking to someone who's familiar intimately with this? Are you talking to a person who specializes in this area? Or are you talking to someone else? And this is the point that we mentioned, Shoshi, before about the intention matters. Is the intention to relieve pain, or is the intention to hasten the end of someone's life? Similarly, about the intention of the treatment. This is an interesting one. The burden of the cost and the care I've seen weighed up as well. Can a family become obligated to pay for a really expensive, complicated treatment? Can a family be halakhically mandated to look after someone who will require really significant care needs post-procedure?
And I think in general, there's a bit of sort of, let's call it inertia, rabbinic inertia, where there's a preference for inaction over action. The rabbis, I think, feel a bit more comfortable to say, we can put it in God's hands and whatever will happen, will happen. I think that that's something that I've detected part of in some of the conversations as well. Yeah.
Would there be a consideration of like the care of family of a parent would that be way out?
Yeah, so the question for those at home is that would kibbud av va'em, the obligation to honor one's parents, would that be part of this conversation as well? I'm sure the answer is yes, but I haven't seen it specifically included. But that's just a function of me not having learned enough, probably. Keep going. Any other questions? So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that it also depends which rabbi's works you look towards. Sort of like we saw, the different rabbis in different time periods and different perspectives have different bottom line laws. I think that's an important thing to say out loud. That if you ask, for example, the Tzitz Eliezer, who we met last week, he was the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, and he's, a world expert. He's passed away in 2006, but he was a world expert in medical halacha. He was known to be relatively on the side of pursuing treatment. That was something that there was a leaning towards that, which was sort of countered on the other side by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who we also met last week. He was in America and he was a world expert on everything. And his leaning was more the other way. He, at least to an extent, had a preference for, on these sort of borderline cases, would have a preference for leaning towards not pursuing. So who you ask depends. And then Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who we hadn't met previously, but we're going to meet for the first time now. So he was an incredibly prominent halachic authority in the 20th century. He was the head of Kol Torah, if that means anything. I'm sure some people in here that will resonate. Reb Shlomo Zalman made a distinction between ordinary and extraordinary treatments. And this is where we can get to the notion about the IV antibiotics. So Reb Shlomo Zalman firstly said that even in a situation where a person is, where we're not going to be pursuing active treatment, you still need to provide the person with oxygen, nutrition, food, and hydration. Those things are non-negotiables because he saw that as sort of core part of what it means to be a person. Just like I wouldn't not provide anyone in this room with oxygen, nutrition, and hydration, so too, a person who's at the end of their life shouldn't be deprived of those things. You don't need to necessarily embark on a, very risky surgery, but you do need to always provide oxygen, nutrition, and hydration, in the opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman. Then the question, well, what's oxygen? Is that a ventilator? Is that a Hudson mask? What's oxygen? So something to keep in mind as well. My understanding is that oxygen, you don't need to go all the way to a ventilator. That's how, Sarah. No, it's okay. No.
Does the Rav Shlomo read like this and only this, or like whatever's ordinary in that day? Like if it's ordinary for every patient to have a COVID vaccine, hypothetically.
Yeah. I did read the tshuva, but I'm not familiar enough with it off the top of my head to. I can share it with you after if you want. Yeah, I'll share it with you after. Other things that he might put in the ordinary basket are insulin for a diabetic, or a blood transfusion, or antibiotics. So that's just something to keep in mind. Whereas extraordinary, things that cause pain or things that seek to extend life, but don't have an option of possibly curing someone's life. So if there's a surgery that you could do, or there's a medication that you could take, which would extend your life by a certain amount of time, he wouldn't view that as obligatory. Is that okay? Yeah, Shoshi. Can I put that in the too hard basket? The question for those at home are, what if we overlay this with resource shortages? What if we overlay the stuff that we're learning about, there are certain ordinary treatments that are obligatory in a situation where, for example, there are resource constraints and limitations on what we actually can provide? And my response is, great question. I can't think that through off the top of my head here, but yeah, it's a fascinating question. Should we keep going? Okay, very quickly. The two, I brought two responses for us to learn together. Maybe we'll just do the second one because of the time. Both of these responsa, so responsa is a fancy English word for shoot, she'elot utshuvot, questions and answers. And that's when people write questions to rabbis who are the ones that are sort of viewed by the community as having the authority to answer these questions. And these rabbis are enormous. Like, you know, in Australia, we don't really have the sorts of people. We have some experts, certainly, but, you know, generally speaking, this is not your average shul community rabbi. This is really, really senior people. They are the ones who provide guidance on really complicated questions. And one of the core authorities who's alive at the moment is a person who I really admire and look up to, is Rabbi Osher Weiss. He is currently the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. He's the posek of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. He's got a series of institutions and he does a lot of educational work. He was actually born in Borough Park and made his way to Israel, which is a very interesting part of the conversation as well, that someone who's so American has become so universally accepted. He's a fascinating person. Now, his compilation of responsa is called the Minchas Osher, or Minchat Asher. In that collection, he poses, or he was asked, a fascinating question. And the word defibrillator is written in English, even in the middle of his Hebrew. So what does he say? If you have someone, and the context for this question is someone who is at the end of their life, I think it's someone who had a terminal cancer and was in an enormous amount of pain, and there's a whole lot of other background. But the situation is if someone has a defibrillator, and that defibrillator, it's a pacemaker. So different pacemakers work differently, but essentially some of them just pace. So that's, you know, zapping the heart at regular intervals so that the heart is going to beat in the rhythm and the frequency that is necessary. In addition to that, you can also have a pacemaker that's implanted in someone's chest. Okay, and that pacemaker, its job is, if the person's heart is not working for whatever reason, then that pacemaker, that defibrillator, in the same way that a person would in, you know, the CPR course that I'm sure a lot of people in this room have done, you learn the CPR course, it zaps the heart in the same way and it defibrillates, it'll restart the heart, if you will. So there's a whole lot of different pacemakers that exist. The specifics of them are really complicated, way above my head. But you've got one here that does both jobs. It's a defibrillator and it's a pacemaker. Now, we spoke about removing obstacles to someone's life. What about an object like this? It's implanted, it's inside their chest. They've had an operation and it's been put in. What do we think Rav Osher Weiss would say? It's exactly like the salt. How is it potentially different to the salts? Maybe. Yep. Okay, so the way to deactivate one of these things is with a magnet that you just go like this. That's how you deactivate one of these things.
Right, so you don't have to actually.
You don't have, no, you don't have to operate on them to remove it. Fascinating way to think about it. I guess that's the core question, is how similar is this thing to the salt? That's the core question. How similar is this device which is implanted to the salt? So, pardon?
It's not the same at all.
So,
well, the Ramah, back when we did the Ramah, he says that you can remove the salt from the person's tongue, for there is no direct act involved in this, are the words we read from him, which is weird because there is a very direct act involved in taking salt away from a person's tongue. So that's why this would seem like the same thing.
The direct action, so for those at home, what Hillel was mentioning was about there's no direct act. in the salt that the Ramah was referring to. That's probably an issue with my translation more than anything else, because I think what it's meant to be is that there's no direct action which causes the person to die rather than a direct action full stop. I think it's a more translation on my end issue. Yep. Yeah, go for it.
I guess, like, depending on how fast you're going to be about the evidence-based or efficacy of it, meaning if that was the belief or convention at the time that salt, did things as a departure of the salt, compared with our time when we're going to have a lot of evidence and previous cases and backing that, but like of the way the pacemaker works to save lives, whereas salt, at least the way I'm interpreting it, is a bit more questionable, but maybe that is narrow-mindedness on my part.
Yeah, so I think what Sarah was mentioning was about the potential efficacy of the salts, and she's, I think, if it's fair to say, positioning the pacemaker and the defibrillator in a different category to the salts.
Yeah, I would do that too.
Yeah.
Because it's acting in a much more positive way.
Yeah. So I guess that's maybe a framing point that we have to consider is how does all of this work once we're taking ideas that are being written in books from hundreds and even thousands of years ago? How does that map onto concepts from today? Pardon? Oh. How does that map onto concepts from today? What I'll do is I'll let you know what the Minchas Osher actually says, and we'll read it together. BRT B'chelek Aleph, I have already previously explained, and you can read this in the one above, who is at the end of their life, who is suffering. We are not obligated to employ, to use, to engage with non-natural mechanisms in order to extend their suffering. Notice the framing. Extend their suffering. That is not necessary. That is not something we are commanded to do. Stress, for a person who chooses that and who wants that, we're not saying there's a problem with pursuing active treatment, but it's not a necessary thing that one must halachically choose. There is no difference between a machine which is sitting inside a person, in a person's chest, breast, and some external machine. You can see where this is going. The same way that you do not have an obligation, it is permissible to prevent, it is permissible to not zap the person in order to restart their heart, which has stopped. So too, you are prevented from turning this thing off. I just thought that was a fascinating example. Pardon? Sorry, you guys all understood because you are all amazing. Sorry, my brain went too quick. Yeah, you're permitted to turn the thing off if that's what is chosen. And again, I don't want us to jump too far ahead. Every case is different, and every case that's as complicated and deep as this requires further conversations. However, I want us to get into our minds that these ideas do exist, and we sort of find a complicated way to balance the valuing of all life with the recognition that some people at the end of their lives are suffering greatly, and prolonging their lives is really a difficult thing. A couple of quick questions, and then we'll hand over to Shimon. Yeah. Go for it. Oh, yeah, whoever, go for it.
I think the key point is what you attribute the issue of the salt. The salt, the way I see it, is something that in some way, and we don't need to know in what way, is preventing the rapid death of the patient. But the removal of the salt does not in itself kill the patient immediately. So I think other arguments about how close it is to the salt don't require a mechanism, all they require is a principle. And this is the same principle. I imagine that if you turn off the defibrillator or even a pacemaker, the instant of turning off is not lethal. You simply increase the risk that that patient of an adverse coronary event.
Fascinating. So
That's
Philip,
the way I understand.
you understand everything.
No, I went to a talk with them last week on resuscitation.
people using defibrillators.
There you go. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, so the question that we're being asked is, what about in a hypothetical situation? This is for the people at home on Zoom. What about in a hypothetical situation where there was a treatment option that could work, for example, a new heart? And I think as soon as that conversation starts, we get back into the conversation that we mentioned at the very beginning about weighing up, are you able to risk chaye sha'ah for a longer period of time, chaye olam? And then, the question becomes, how much longer are you expecting? What's the level of risk that you're entertaining, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, the principles, like we were hearing, the principles exist, and it's about working out how those principles apply to that specific case. Yep. Last question, and then maybe we'll hand over to Shimon.
I'm just wondering about how would you rate, for instance, dementia as against physical suffering in terms of, what you're allowed to do in terms of suffering?
Yeah. So I think that's a really deep question. For the people at home, the question was, what about conditions like dementia? How does that map onto or not map onto something like suffering? That's a really hard question. And to be really honest, I don't feel I don't feel that I have the resources to answer that question properly. I think, that's something that I don't know enough about to answer as well as I'd like to. But it's a great question. All right, let's hand over to Shimon. Shimon, are you ready? Cool.
Thank you very much.
We're just transferring, we're getting you up on the screen. Give us 1 second, Shimon.
Is Rob Yanni still in town? Is that my one?
Yeah. Also, if people on Zoom or elsewhere have questions, I'm happy to continue the conversation after Shimon's part of the presentation. But yeah, I think we're all really lucky and privileged to have Shimon here speaking with us.
Good evening, everyone. I'd first of all like to thank Rav Noam and Rav Avi for including me in this most important discussion this evening. I think I can say without any hesitation at all that medical halacha is the most refined and it is the most sublime area within Jewish law. And therefore great knowledge is required by those who are able to sit and discuss and to come to halachic decisions. My time will be relatively limited, and so therefore I'm going to move fairly quickly, and you'll forgive me, but I'm happy to answer any questions that may arise. So the first question is that everything that we know within our Judaism is either based on the written Torah or the oral law. So how do we know that there is room within our Yiddishkeit for an advanced medical healthcare directive? I don't know if anybody can just indicate whether they have an idea as to what that may be, but I'll just continue to say that we find that in the Sefer Bereshis, in chapter Mem Zayin, chapter 47, that Jacob, at the end of his life, implores Joseph, to bury him with his forefathers. And the English translation for Chumash is, if I have found grace, bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt, but I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me up from Egypt and bury me in their burying place. And Joseph said to Jacob, that I will do in accordance with thy words. So this is where we have the foundation in halacha for an advanced medical care directive. What is the reason for an advanced medical care directive? Or how many of you are familiar with an advanced medical care directive. Certainly in Victoria and within each state in Australia, there is a directive available, which is a legally binding document. And why do we need such a document? The answer to that is that in years gone by, people became sick and subsequently passed away. With today's modern technology, we can keep patients alive via aggressive intervention for long periods of time, including for those patients who are not alert to or able to express their own wishes. But the question is that what the patient really wants? Rav Avi has previously mentioned Harav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal. And Harav Moshe refers us to the tefillah of the Musaf on the Yom Kippur, relating to the execution as what is known as the 10 martyrs, and specifically quotes the execution of Rav Hanania ben Tradgan, who, when asked by his executioner that if he, the executioner, would remove the tufts of wool, the balls of wool, which had been placed around Rav Hanania's heart to increase the pain and increase the period of time that it would take for him to die, if the executioner, if he was to remove that, would Reb Hanania promise he, the executioner, that he would join him in Olam Haba, in the world to come? And Reb Hanania answered in the affirmative, and the executioner did remove the tufts of wool and threw himself onto the fire that he should die with Reb Hanania. And this is just a terrible thing to contemplate. But the important part about this is, the halachic part is, Reb Hanania did not open his mouth to allow the flames to enter his body so that he would die more quickly. I'm going to jump forward in time to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, who Rav Avi has also mentioned. And in his Sefer Shulchan Shlomo, he cites the case of a dangerously ill person for whom the only way to preserve his life is to amputate a limb. In this case, the person's leg, because it had become gangrene. Harav Reb Shlomo Zalman stated his psak halacha that such a person has the right to refuse to have his leg amputated because the person expresses that it will rob him of his dignity. Plus, if he cannot walk on his own feet, he will be miserable. And additionally, the person stated that he does not wish to become a member, does not wish to become a burden on his family members. So in very short terms, I'm trying to take an example which we have from our Masorah, from our literature, and I'm trying to take a question in halacha which has been decided by one of the halachic codifiers of our generation, to see as to the situation that a person is able to have some input into their wishes as to what their treatment should be. Rav Waldenberg, in his Sefer Tzitz Eliezer, writes that one is not obligated or even permitted to initiate artificial life support and or other resuscitative efforts if it is obvious that the patient is terminally and incurably ill with no chance of recovery. So we can see that the parameters are very broad in what the halacha allows for. As Rav Avi has mentioned, we know that although it is completely forbidden to actively, and actively is the key word here, shorten end of life of a person, nevertheless, we're not commanded to prolong the life of a person who is seriously ill. So we can see from our sages and from our poskim, from halachic codifiers, that a person has a right to state the type of treatment they will receive. Even more so, where today we are discussing that a person is setting out what future treatment they will either refuse or are willing to undergo. Most people will have completed a tzavah, a will. There is strong evidence, however, that most married couples, or for that matter, any independent person over, say, the age of 20, will not have what we refer to as a living will or an advanced healthcare directive. We all take our good health for granted, but at the same time, we know that in the blink of an eye, this can unfortunately change. It could, God forbid, be due to a major accident, a severe stroke, a heart attack, an incurable disease, or many other medical conditions. Therefore, the question is, with any type of severe medical illness, how would you wish to be treated? Our directive will help to minimize the terrible burden placed on a family who must face the difficult decisions in such situations, decisions which their sick loved one would not necessarily agree to. The grief, the heartbreak, the stress, the angst, and the arguments which occur, all these are real emotions that take place within a family at that time, and these raw emotions cannot be emphasized enough. As an aside, the directive also solves the dilemmas faced by doctors as to the course of treatment for the patient. You may not be aware of this, but it is important to note and to keep in mind that not every type of medical procedure or intervention is necessarily in the patient's best interest. Therefore, you must ask yourself, together with medical counsel, would you wish to be intubated and rely on mechanical support for the rest of your life? Would you wish ongoing chemotherapy? Would you wish to be resuscitated? Would you wish to undergo kidney dialysis? Depending on the severity of the condition, the answers to such a question may be different for a person who is 35 as compared to somebody who is 85. Let's look at a current case. We will call her Ima, and she could in fact be anyone's Ima. Ima is 79 years of age, but does not have an advanced healthcare directive. Ima suffers from end-stage lung disease and pneumonia. Even before catching pneumonia, she could only walk a few steps unaided. If her pneumonia is treated, it is likely to take a long time for her to recover, and her breathing will be further impaired. When rushed to hospital, Ima could not communicate her wishes herself. And here I wish to point out that according to Victorian government statistics, 46% of people who are rushed to hospital in an emergency situation are not able to communicate directly with the medical team. But her husband thought she should be given a chance to recover. So when Emma stopped breathing, she was resuscitated. Surgeons then cut a hole in her neck and inserted a tube that she could breathe through. Another tube was inserted through her nose and down into her stomach in order that she could be fed. Over the following weeks, many catheters were inserted to administer drugs, as well as drainage tubes to remove fluid from around her lungs. The antibiotics gave Emma diarrhea, which in turn made the skin on her bottom inflamed, necessitating treatment. Finally, the pneumonia was cured, and the doctors tried to remove her from the ventilator. But when they did, she stopped breathing. Then she contracted another chest infection, and subsequently her kidneys failed. After much discussion, the doctors and the families agreed Emma was not going to improve and survive. So, under sedation, in order that she will not feel any pain, she was taken off the ventilator, and a few minutes later, she passed away. All of this treatment was initiated since Emma was not able to communicate her treatment wishes, and her husband thought, as we said earlier, she should be given a chance. As a result, the doctors marshaled all their experience and technology to save Emma for a few short weeks of absolute misery, with tubes in her body and a machine breathing for her. One of the attending doctors stated that Emma's death was so much worse than it might have been. Now let us imagine that Emma had an advanced care directive in place. If someone were to sit with you and your wife and ask a series of questions about each other's likes or dislikes, I'm quite sure that your respective answers would not be in sync. That is, the answer you or your wife gave would be different from what the other thought the answer would be. We, of course, will laugh about such a scenario, for it is not particularly critical, since you have the ability to continue to speak to each other. That is in relation to everyday living. How much more so will there be misunderstanding and different thoughts in a situation of high emotion and stress, where the husband and wife, the child and parent, the brother and sister do not have the ability to speak to one another? Then what? The enhanced advanced care directive is in some ways even more important than an actual will, for it allows a person to set out now for the treating doctors and family members their personal values relating to the how they wish to lead their life when they are unable to communicate those wishes themselves. Their instructions about medical procedures and interventions that they will accept or refuse, and their instructions concerning halachic issues such as whether they will accept cessation of the heart or brain death as their definition of death. All these personal points of instruction will guide and paint a picture. They give texture and context for the treating medical team and the appointed medical treatment decision maker in caring for any Jewish person in the way that they instruct, want, wish, without the need for futile treatment as was suffered by Emma. Without our directive, family and doctors will often undertake what are referred to as heroic actions to save the person. Even though, as we've said previously, it may not be in their best interest. Please, I ask you to refer to the document. It can be found on the Beit Raphael website, beitraphael.org. If you click on to learn more and then go in and find the forms tab at the top of the page, then you'll be able to see the document in its full context. And I hope that by reading through it and seeing how it is structured in a very clear manner, physical and bodily considerations, cognitive considerations, interactive, social, and community considerations, each of those issues are addressed, and by completing it, then that will allow for serenity within a family, and from a halachic perspective, it will help to eliminate any questions which may surround the situation of end of life. May we all be blessed with good health, and thank you very much for taking the time to listen. I don't know if there's any questions at all.
Shimon, you can't. I don't think you can see it because of the way we've got the cameras set up, but you've got about 30 or 40 people here who are all just clapping and applauding you for your presentation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Were there any questions either for Shimon or for myself? Yep.
Well, the issue is that if you are rushed into hospital, who knows that you've got a directive? I mean, can the medical staff actually look it up?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that from personal experience, we can, the question, sorry, for those at home is, how do the doctors know that you have an advanced care directive? For personal experience, that's something that, I certainly try and prioritize checking. Like, I was working in busy emergency departments not too long ago, and that was something that I made an effort to check. It was often on patients' My Health records, or it was sent in together with the patient. However, to be honest, there are potentially times when, in the busyness of everything going on, I could anticipate it being missed. And to that end, if they're a family or loved ones who are familiar with, they know that you have the advanced care directive, I think that's always something that's useful to let the treating team know as well. Yeah. Any other questions for Shimon or for myself? Okay, so thank you all enormously for coming tonight. Really, really appreciate it. I'm happy to stick around for a while. As I'm sure, Shimon, I'm speaking on behalf of you, but I'm saying you're also happy to stick around for a little bit as well if people do have questions. Just to let everyone know, so next week we are going to do another session at the same time, 8 o'clock. We'll do again here, as well as a Zoom option for those who that works better for. We'll be talking about organ donation is the hope for next week. Thank you enormously. Really, really appreciate it. Lovely to see you all.